For 5 years and 3 days, the highest volcano alert level in the United States has been assigned to the same mountain, and it has not changed once. Almost nobody can name it. It sits out in the Aleutian Islands, quietly filling its own summit crater with lava, and it is one of 4 separate warnings that landed on that arc in the last 10 days. A steam explosion at a crater lake at 3:55 in the morning, 2 earthquakes on the seafloor 11 hours apart, and a volcano that has not stopped erupting since 2021. None of those events are connected to each other, and the reason they are not is far stranger than any chain reaction. It comes down to a single layer of cloud at 10,000 feet. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. Part 1. The explosion. Nobody saw. At 3:55 in the morning local time on the 16th of July 2026, a mountain in the middle of the North Pacific blew a hole in itself for 10 minutes. Nobody heard it. Nobody saw it. The nearest town holds 57 people and sits 10 miles to the south, and at that hour on an Aleutian summer morning the island was wrapped in the kind of low grey overcast that sits on those islands for most of the year. What registered the event was not a person, and not a camera. It was a network of seismometers listening to the ground, and a set of infrasound sensors listening to the air. The mountain is called Korovin. It is a stratovolcano standing 1,553 metres, or 5,030 feet, and it is the most historically active vent inside a cluster of volcanoes known as the Atka Volcanic Complex. At its summit sits a small crater lake, and the Alaska Volcano Observatory uses a specific word for that lake in its published descriptions. They call it roiling, not calm, not still. Roiling, a body of water permanently agitated by the heat underneath it. Within hours, the observatory raised the aviation colour code and the alert level for the Atka Volcanic Complex to yellow and advisory. A small phreatic explosion, the bulletin said, originating at Korovin's summit crater lake. Detected in seismic and infrasound data. That is the whole event. 10 minutes, 1 crater lake, 1 alert level, on an island roughly 1,100 air miles southwest of Anchorage. It is worth pausing on what those alert levels are because 2 separate scales get quoted in volcano coverage, and they measure different things. The first is the volcano alert level, and it runs normal, advisory, watch, warning. Normal means the volcano is in its background state. Advisory means it is showing signs of elevated unrest above that background. Watch means it is either erupting, or unrest has escalated to the point where a hazardous eruption is possible. Warning is reserved for a hazardous eruption that is imminent, underway, or expected imminently. The second scale is the aviation colour code, and it runs green, yellow, orange, red. It exists because the single most reliable way for a remote volcano to kill people is not lava, and not ash fall on a town. It is putting powdered rock into a flight corridor. Green is background. Yellow is elevated unrest. Orange means an eruption is underway with little or no ash emission, or unrest has escalated significantly. Red means an eruption is underway with significant ash emission into the atmosphere. The complex was moved to yellow and advisory, elevated, noted, watched, and, on the scales that exist to describe this, near the bottom. 9 days later, the seafloor about 60 miles southeast of that same island moved twice, and the entire time all of this was happening, a volcano 200 kilometers to the west had been sitting at the highest volcano alert level assigned anywhere in the United States, where it had been sitting, without interruption, for 5 years. So here is what this video is, stated plainly, because I would rather you know the shape of the argument before we start than have me sell you a mystery I intend to dissolve at the end. 4 separate volcanic and seismic warnings landed on one stretch of the Aleutian arc inside 10 days. They are almost certainly not connected to each other. There is no chain reaction here, no cascade, no dominoes. I am going to show you exactly why, using the physics and, more damningly, using the calendar. The reason this is worth your time anyway is what happened when I tried to check. Because when the observatory went looking for confirmation of that explosion on July 16th, when they pulled the satellite imagery to see whether an ash plume had formed and how high it had gone, they found nothing. Not because the satellites failed, not because the explosion was too small. The bulletin gives the reason in a single clause, and that clause is the hinge this entire story turns on. No emissions were identified in satellite images, but regional weather clouds obscured views below 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers, roughly 10,000 feet. A layer of ordinary Aleutian overcast, the kind that sits over those islands more days than not, and the single most useful diagnostic available. Did this thing produce an ash column, and if so, how tall, and was simply gone? Unavailable, not classified, not withheld, not lost, just behind a cloud. That is the most volcanically active region in the United States, and it can be switched off by weather. The instrument that did work is worth understanding, because it tells you what monitoring in this part of the world actually looks like. Infrasound is sound below the range of human hearing. Pressure waves at frequencies too low for your ear to register, typically under 20 Hz. Those waves have a property that ordinary audible sound does not. They are barely absorbed by the atmosphere. A pressure pulse that would fade to nothing in a few kilometers, at a frequency you could hear, will travel hundreds of kilometers at frequencies you cannot. Networks of infrasound arrays exploit exactly this, and they are one of the main reasons anyone can say anything at all about eruptions in places nobody lives. So on the morning of July 16th, the Atka volcanic complex was heard rather than seen. A seismic signal from the ground, a pressure signal through the air, and a duration. Those two signals together do more than either does alone. A seismic signal by itself is ambiguous. The ground shakes for a great many reasons, and a small local earthquake and a small explosion can look uncomfortably similar on a single trace. But an explosion couples energy into the air as well as into the rock, and an earthquake at depth largely does not. When the seismic network and the infrasound network both register the same event at the same moment, the ambiguity collapses. Something happened at the surface, and it happened violently enough to move the atmosphere. That is how an observatory establishes that a volcano exploded on an island where nobody was standing and no camera was pointed. The duration matters more than it sounds. A single sharp rupture, a seal failing all at once, registers as a bang, over in seconds. What the sensors recorded lasted roughly 10 minutes. That is not a bang. That is sustained venting, a system that opened a pathway and then kept pushing material through it, minute after minute, until whatever pressure was driving it had bled down enough to stop. And then, immediately afterward, the ground went quiet. Elevated seismicity, the observatory noted, declined immediately after the event. Hold on to that detail, because it is going to become the strongest piece of evidence for the most reassuring reading of everything that follows, and it is going to sit directly opposite a piece of evidence that points the other way. Here is the inventory of what is currently happening in this one arc. 5 volcanoes in the United States are on elevated alert as I record this. 4 of them are in Alaska. Not one is in the lower 48. The 5th is a seamount in the northern Marianas that nobody can see because it is underwater. 4 out of 5. And the American volcano at the very top of that list, the only one in the country at watch and orange rather than advisory and yellow, is a mountain. Most people who follow this subject closely could not pick out of a lineup. The explosion on the 16th of July was small. It was self-limiting. It was over in 10 minutes and it endangered nobody. And I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because I have no interest in telling you that 57 people in the North Pacific are about to die. They are not. But there is a question sitting underneath this that the small size of the explosion does not answer. And it is the question that made me want to spend 2 hours on a volcano that did almost nothing. If Korovin's explosions arrive without warning, and the observatory's own standing description of this volcano says exactly that, then why had they been watching this mountain since the 8th of March? Part 2, 57 people. 57. That is not a measurement of anything geological. It is the entire population of the city of Atka in 2026. Every resident, every household, every person on the island. Atka sits on the eastern shore of Atka Island, which is the largest island in the Andrianov group, roughly halfway along the Aleutian chain, as it curves west from the Alaskan mainland toward Russia. Anchorage is approximately 1,100 air miles to the northeast. To put that distance in a frame that might land better, it is roughly the flight from New York to Miami, except the route runs over open North Pacific and terminates at a settlement of 57 people. The volcanic complex sits about 10 miles north of the community. That is the geometry of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Not 10 miles of highway, 10 miles of treeless volcanic terrain on an island in the Bering Sea, between a village and a cluster of vents that includes Korovin, Mount Klushev, and Sarashev, centered at 52.331 degrees north, 174.139 degrees west. The word complex in that name is doing real work. This is not one mountain with one conduit. A volcanic complex is a group of vents and edifices that share a magmatic system underneath, but express it at the surface in separate places, sometimes over quite a wide area. That is why alert levels here are issued for the Atka volcanic complex as a unit, rather than for Korovin alone, even when Korovin is the vent doing the erupting. Activity can migrate between vents. Unrest recorded by instruments distributed across the complex does not necessarily tell you which cone is going to open. So when the observatory logged a rise in earthquakes and tremors at the complex in March, the honest description of what they knew is that something in a multi-vent system had become restless. Which one, and how deep, is a harder question than the alert level makes it sound. The population trend is its own quiet story. 58 people in 2020, 57 in 2026, a decline of roughly 1.72% per year, which at that scale means the community is shrinking by something like one person every 18 months. The people who live there are almost entirely Unangan. Atka is described in the record as the last surviving traditional Unangan community in the area. The total Unangak's population is somewhere around 2,000 people, spread thin across an island chain that runs for well over 1,000 miles. That phrase, the last surviving traditional community in the area, carries a weight that a population figure does not. The Aleutians were inhabited for thousands of years before anyone was drawing alert-level maps of them, and the villages that used to dot these islands are mostly gone. What remains at Atka is not a research outpost or a fishing camp that happens to sit near a volcano. It is a continuously inhabited place with a language, and 57 people is what continuity looks like at the far end of that history. It also means something quite specific for hazard assessment. When an agency computes the expected impact of an earthquake or an eruption, it is running a population model. Low population produces a low number, and a low number produces a green alert, and a green alert produces no news coverage. The model is not wrong, but it measures the size of the consequence, not the size of the event, and those two things have been decoupled in the Aleutians for as long as anyone has been measuring either. I am telling you this not as background colour, but because it is load-bearing for everything that comes next. Remoteness does two things at once here, and they pull in opposite directions. The first thing it does is lower the stakes of any individual event. When the ground southeast of Atka moved at magnitude 5.8, the United States Geological Survey assigned it a green alert on their impact scale, meaning no expected fatalities, no expected economic losses. That green rating is not a statement about the earthquake, it is a statement about the map. There is almost nothing there to damage. The second thing remoteness does is degrade the ability to see anything at all. Consider what monitoring the Aleutians actually requires. The instruments, seismometers, infrasound sensors, webcams, gas sensors, sit on uninhabited or barely inhabited islands strung across 1,000 miles of some of the roughest water on the planet. Power has to be generated on site or carried in. Maintenance requires a ship or an aircraft, and both require a weather window in a region where weather windows are the exception. A sensor that goes down in the Aleutians is not a same-day repair, and in some cases it is not a same-season repair. Then layer the cloud on top of it. Satellite observation is the tool that is supposed to fill the gaps between physical instruments, and satellites in this part of the world spend a great deal of their time photographing the top of an overcast layer. There is a second consequence of the geography that gets less attention, and it concerns what happens after something is detected. When a volcano in the continental United States shows unrest, the response chain is dense. There are highways, there is a county emergency manager, there are broadcast stations, there are people close enough to look out of a window and report what they see. Ground truth is cheap. In the central Aleutians, ground truth is close to unobtainable. There is no road to Korovin. There is no observer with a line of sight who can call in and say whether there is a plume above the crater. The only eyes on that mountain are instrumental, and when the instruments that see are blinded by cloud, what is left are the instruments that listen. That is why the July 16th bulletin can state with confidence that an explosion occurred and, in the same breath, be unable to say whether it produced an ash cloud. The observatory did not fail to look. There was nothing available to look with. So the same isolation that means an eruption here is unlikely to kill anyone is also the isolation that means an eruption. Here is the hardest kind to characterize. The consequences are low and the visibility is low, and those two facts are not independent. They are the same fact viewed from two directions. There is a version of this story that treats that as a scandal. I do not think it is one. Nobody decided to stop watching the Aleutians. The Alaska Volcano Observatory monitors this arc with local seismic and infrasound sensors, satellite data, webcams, and regional infrasound and lightning networks, and it publishes what it finds, promptly and publicly and in detail. What it cannot do is put a permanent, all-weather, high-resolution eye on every vent across a chain that spans the width of the continental United States, for a resident population that would not fill a high school gymnasium. The question this video is actually about is not whether 57 people are in danger tonight. They are not, and nothing in the data suggests otherwise. The question is whether anyone would know in time if they were. And the record from March is about to give us a partial answer, because it turns out the observatory saw something coming 4 months before it arrived. Part 3. The 4 months before. There is a sentence that appears in one form or another throughout the published material on this volcano, and it says this: brief explosive events at Korovin Volcano are not uncommon and can occur without significant precursory unrest. That is the Alaska Volcano Observatory's own characterization. Explosions here come without warning. It is a statement made with authority by the people who have watched this mountain longest, and I have no reason to doubt it. And yet, on the 8th of March, 2026, the Atka volcanic complex began producing a rise in small earthquakes and tremors. 6 days later, on the 14th of March, between 4:20 in the afternoon and 4:30 in the afternoon local time, that activity spiked. A substantial increase in seismic activity inside a 10-minute window, sharp enough and sustained enough that the observatory raised the aviation color code to yellow and the alert level to advisory that day. 2 days after that, on the 16th of March, the shaking had not stopped. Weak to moderate tremor was continuing, and satellite imagery, on that same date, was detecting 2 additional things at the complex: elevated levels of sulfur dioxide gas and elevated surface temperatures. Those last 2 measurements are the ones that change the reading, and I want to slow down on both of them because most coverage of volcanic unrest lists them as though they were interchangeable with tremor. They are not. Start with sulfur dioxide. Volcanoes emit a range of gases, and the mix tells you where the gas is coming from. Water vapor and carbon dioxide can come from a hydrothermal system. Groundwater circulating through hot rock, picking up whatever it dissolves along the way, venting at the surface as steam. A hydrothermal system can run for decades without anything molten being anywhere near the surface, and it can produce impressive-looking steam plumes while doing so. Sulfur dioxide is different. It is not readily produced by water sitting on warm rock. Sulfur dioxide comes out of magma. When magma rises and depressurizes, dissolved sulfur comes out of solution as gas, and if there is a pathway to the surface, that gas escapes. A hydrothermal system can also scrub sulfur out of rising gas. The water absorbs it, which means that when you start detecting sulfur dioxide at the surface from orbit, one of 2 things is happening. Either there is more gas than the water can absorb, or the pathway has opened up enough that the gas is getting past the water. Both of those are statements about magma, not about groundwater. Now the thermal anomaly. An elevated surface temperature detected by satellite over an Aleutian island in March is not a subtle signal. This is a place where ambient conditions are cold, wet, and cloudy, and any thermal signature has to be strong enough and persistent enough to punch through both the cold background and the frequent cloud cover to register at all. So the picture from the middle of March is not a volcano twitching. It is a volcano producing sustained tremor, venting magmatic gas in quantities visible from space and running warm enough to show up as a thermal anomaly. There is one more thing worth separating out, and it is the word tremor, because it is doing quiet work in that timeline, and it does not mean what most people assume. A normal earthquake is a discrete event. Something breaks, energy radiates. The trace shows a sharp arrival and then a decay, and it is over in seconds. Volcanic tremor is not that. Tremor is a continuous, sustained vibration that can run for minutes, hours, or days without a clear beginning or end, and the leading explanation for it is fluid moving. Magma, gas, or superheated water forcing its way through cracks and resonating the rock around it. the way blowing across the neck of a bottle produces a tone rather than a click. That distinction matters for how you read the March record. A cluster of small, discrete earthquakes tells you rock is breaking somewhere. Sustained tremor tells you something is flowing, and weak to moderate tremor persisting for more than a week, alongside sulfur dioxide and a thermal anomaly, describes a system with fluid moving through it continuously, not a system that cracked once and settled. Then count the days. The 8th of March to the 16th of July is 4 months and 8 days. 4 months and 8 days of documented, published, escalating unrest, ending in an explosion at a volcano whose official description says its explosions can arrive without significant precursory unrest. I want to be careful here, because there is a cheap version of this observation and an honest one. The cheap version says the observatory contradicted itself, or missed something, or downplayed a warning. That is not what happened, and the record does not support it. The honest version is this. Both things are true at once, and the tension between them is the actual scientific problem. Korovin genuinely does produce explosions without warning, and this particular explosion happened to be preceded by 4 months of signals. Those facts do not cancel each other. They coexist, and the reason they coexist is that this volcano vents frequently enough that its baseline includes a great deal of activity that goes nowhere. Look at the record and the pattern becomes obvious. In 1998, an eruption at Korovin sent an ash plume as high as 35,000 feet above sea level. That number deserves more than a passing mention, because 35,000 feet is not an abstraction. It is cruising altitude. Commercial aircraft crossing between North America and Asia fly the great circle routes that arc up over exactly this part of the world, and they fly them at somewhere between 30 and 40,000 feet. A plume to 35,000 feet from an Aleutian volcano is a plume placed directly into the lanes, and volcanic ash is uniquely hostile to a jet engine. It is not soot. It is pulverized rock and volcanic glass, and it melts at temperatures well below the operating temperature inside a modern turbine. Ingested ash melts in the combustor, then resolidifies on the cooler turbine components downstream, glazing them and choking the airflow. The result is thrust loss, and, in the documented worst cases, flame out of every engine at once. It also abrades windscreens to opacity, contaminates the pitot-static system the aircraft uses to know its own airspeed, and enters the bleed air system that pressurizes the cabin. Worse, aircraft weather radar cannot reliably see it. That radar is tuned to return off water droplets, and a dry ash cloud gives almost nothing back. At night, or embedded inside ordinary cloud, an ash cloud is effectively invisible from the flight deck, which is why the entire system is built on advisories and avoidance rather than detection, and why an observatory in Alaska raising a color code matters to somebody flying from Chicago to Tokyo who will never hear the name Korovin. In March of 2024, a small eruption occurred on a Wednesday night. It was short-lived. No significant ash emissions were observed in satellite images, and the alert levels went up and came back down. On the 20th of February, 2025, at 26 minutes past 7 in the evening, an explosion was detected and the observatory moved the aviation color code and alert level all the way to watch, before reducing it to advisory once things settled. That February event is the interesting one in the sequence, because watch is a genuine escalation. It is the level that says either this volcano is erupting, or unrest has reached a point where a hazardous eruption is a real possibility. The observatory went there, on the strength of a single explosion, at 7:30 on a February evening, and then walked it back down when the volcano did not follow through. Read the whole pattern, and a rhythm emerges that is almost administrative. Something explodes. The alert goes up. The volcano falls silent. The alert comes back down, typically within about a week. Repeat, roughly annually. The October 2025 event followed exactly that arc, returning to normal 7 days later. 4 times in 3 years the system has run that loop, and 4 times it has closed. On the 29th of October, 2025, a brief explosion prompted another short-lived advisory, and scientists determined activity had quieted and lowered the alert back to normal within a week. Then, July 16th, 2026. That is 1998, 2024, twice in 2025, and once in 2026. In the last 3 years, this volcano has produced 4 separate explosive events significant enough to change its alert level. So the frame that actually fits the data is not warning versus no warning. It is cadence. This is a volcano that vents on something close to an annual rhythm, small and self-limiting each time, and the observatory's language about explosions arriving without warning is a description of that rhythm. Most of these pulses genuinely do come out of a quiet background. Which brings us to the thing that makes 2026 different, and it is the only reason I am building a video around a 10-minute steam explosion. This time, the background was not quiet. This time, there were 4 months of tremor and gas and heat first, and that leaves a question with 2 entirely different answers, and no way, from the surface, to tell which one is right. Was the 16th of July the release of 4 months of accumulated pressure, a system that built up, found a weak point, vented, and reset? Or was it the first small sign of 4 months of loading? Part 4. What a steam explosion actually is. Nothing molten reached the surface on the 16th of July. That is the single most important fact about what happened at Korovin. It is the reason the event was over in 10 minutes, and it is the reason the resulting hazard was close to zero. But it is also the reason the event is so difficult to interpret, and to understand why, you need to understand what a phreatic explosion actually is, mechanically, step by step. The word phreatic comes from the Greek for a well. In volcanology, it means an explosion driven by water rather than by magma. Water meets heat, water flashes to steam, and the expansion does the destroying. No new magma is involved at any point. Nothing erupts in the sense most people picture when they hear the word. Here is the sequence. Step 1. A volcano like Korovin sits above a heat source, and it is riddled with fractures. Rain, snowmelt, and in this case the water of a summit crater lake percolate down through those fractures into rock that gets progressively hotter with depth. Step 2. At depth, that water reaches rock hot enough to boil it, except it does not boil. The weight of the water and rock above holds it under pressure, and water under pressure stays liquid well past the temperature at which it would boil at the surface. This is the same principle a pressure cooker runs on. The water in that system can be far hotter than 100 degrees Celsius and remain entirely liquid as long as the pressure holds. Step 3. Over time, the system seals itself. Hot mineral-rich water circulating through fractures deposits silica and other minerals on the fracture walls, gradually narrowing and then closing the pathways. The system becomes progressively more isolated and more pressurized, and the seal that is holding all of it in place is made of the same minerals the water is carrying. Step 4. The seal fails. It can fail for many reasons. A small local earthquake shaking the structure, gas pressure from below finally exceeding the strength of the cap, a change in the water level or temperature of the lake above, or simple progressive weakening. When it goes suddenly. And there is a vicious feedback built into that moment. The seal is what holds the pressure, and the pressure is what holds the water liquid. So the failure of the seal does not merely release pressure, it removes the only thing preventing the water beneath it from converting to steam. The first small drop in pressure boils the shallowest water, which expands, which drives the pressure down further along the crack, which boils the water below that. The front propagates downward into the system faster than the system can respond to it. The explosion is not a single volume of water letting go, it is a cascade. Step 5. The moment the pressure drops, the superheated water flashes to steam essentially instantaneously. And this is where the destruction comes from, because water expands enormously when it becomes steam at atmospheric pressure, by a factor in the region of 1,600. A volume of water that would fit in a bucket becomes a volume of steam that fills a small room, and it does that in a fraction of a second, inside a confined space, underground. The rock cannot accommodate it. The pressure wave blows the confining material apart and throws it out of the vent. That is a phreatic explosion. It is a plumbing failure, not an eruption. And here is the number that matters most for what comes later in this video. The entire process operates over depths of hundreds of meters, not tens of kilometers, hundreds of meters. This is a shallow local phenomenon confined to the upper skin of the volcano. Korovin is exceptionally well set up for it. That small roiling crater lake is not incidental scenery. It is a permanent reservoir of water sitting directly on top of a hydrothermal system that is directly above a heat source. The observatory notes that the lake periodically produces energetic steam emissions, which is another way of saying the system is chronically close to the threshold. It does not need much to tip it over, which is exactly why this class of explosion is the single hardest thing in volcanology to forecast. Think about what the classic warning signs of an eruption actually measure. Rising magma displaces rock, so the ground deforms and swells. Rising magma cracks rock as it forces its way up, so you get characteristic earthquake swarms migrating upward. Rising magma degasses, so you get gas emissions climbing on a trend. All of those signals are generated by the ascent of magma, and they work reasonably well when magma is ascending. A phreatic explosion does not require magma to ascend at all. The heat source can be entirely static. What changes is the strength of a seal, and a seal failing produces almost no warning above it. Because the seal is a few hundred meters down, it is small, and the process that breaks it is not the process the monitoring network is optimized to detect. That is not a criticism of the monitoring, it is a physical constraint. You're trying to detect the failure of a mineral cap in a fracture network using instruments on the surface, and the failure and the explosion are separated by seconds. There is a further problem, which is one of scale. The signals that precede a magmatic eruption are produced by a large volume of rock responding to a large volume of intruding magma, and large signals are easy to detect against background noise. The signals that precede a seal failure a few hundred meters down are produced by a structure that might be meters across. Even with a perfect instrument sitting directly on the summit, the question is whether the event generates enough energy to rise above the noise floor of a volcano that is already humming with hydrothermal activity, and often it simply does not. This is why phreatic explosions have historically been the ones that catch people, not because they are the largest. They are usually among the smallest events a volcano can produce, but they are the ones that happen at volcanoes officially classified as quiet, on days when no alert level had been raised, in the one part of a volcanic system that is closest to where visitors stand, the crater, the lake, the steaming ground. Korovin has no visitors. That is the only reason its cadence of explosions reads as a curiosity rather than a hazard. So when the Alaska Volcano Observatory says brief explosive events at Korovin can occur without significant precursory unrest, they are not hedging. They are describing the physics of the specific kind of explosion this volcano produces. There is a way to tell the difference after the fact, though, and it is the reason the cloud deck on the 16th of July is more than an inconvenience. If an explosion is purely phreatic, everything it throws out is old rock, fragments of the existing edifice torn apart by steam. If magma is involved directly, the deposits contain fresh volcanic glass, juvenile material that was molten moments before it landed. The presence or absence of that fresh material is the cleanest single test of whether a heat source is merely present or actively rising. Ash tells you which. An ash cloud can be sampled, and even from a distance its height, colour and behaviour carry information about what produced it. A dense, dark, sustained column behaves differently from a white steam plume with rock in it. On the 16th of July there was no ash observation to make that call with, because the layer that would have carried the answer was hidden beneath 10,000 feet of cloud. They also give the hazard assessment plainly. Resulting ash clouds tend to be small and dissipate quickly. On the 16th of July, no ash was confirmed at all, and the reason we cannot say anything stronger than that is the cloud deck rather than the explosion. So we are left with a very specific and very frustrating epistemic position, and it is worth stating exactly. A phreatic explosion tells you there is a heat source down there. It confirms the system is hot, wet, and pressurized. What it does not tell you, what it fundamentally cannot tell you, is whether that heat source is arriving or leaving. Part 5. 2 earthquakes, 11 hours apart. 2103 hours, Coordinated Universal Time, on the 25th of July, that is the first one, a magnitude 5.0, 91 kilometers southeast of Atka, at a depth of 40.8 kilometers. It generated no alert, carried a tsunami flag of 0, and as far as anyone on the surface of the planet was concerned, it did not happen. 11 hours and 32 minutes later, at 8:35 in the morning Coordinated Universal Time, on the 26th of July, the same patch of seafloor produced a magnitude 5.8, 99 kilometers southeast of Atka, depth roughly 10 kilometers. The United States Geological Survey assigned it a green alert on its impact scale and a tsunami flag of 0. The European Monitoring Network placed it at 51.53 degrees north, 173.32 degrees west in the Andrianov Islands. 2 earthquakes, 3 separations worth measuring. In time, 11 hours and 32 minutes, in map distance roughly 8 kilometers, close enough that on any reasonable chart they are the same spot, and in depth approximately 31 kilometers, which is the separation that actually matters. Now notice the order they came in, because it is not the order you would expect. The first event was deeper and smaller, the second was shallower and larger. Whatever this sequence was, it did not decay. It escalated, and it escalated upward. Let me put the magnitude difference into something you can hold. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, and each whole step up represents roughly a 32-fold increase in the energy released. So the gap from 5.0 to 5.8, which sounds trivial when you say it out loud, is close to a 16-fold increase. The second earthquake released something like 16 times the energy of the first, and in the 12 hours before this data was compiled, that magnitude 5.8 was the largest earthquake recorded anywhere on Earth. Two of the labels attached to it deserve unpacking, because both get misread constantly. The first is the green alert. That rating comes from an automated impact system that takes the earthquake's parameters, runs them against models of population density, local building stock, and expected shaking, and produces an estimate of likely fatalities and economic losses. Green is the lowest band, no expected deaths, negligible expected damage. It is genuinely useful, and it is also worth understanding what it is measuring. Green is not a statement that the earthquake was small. It is a statement that there was almost nothing underneath it. Move that identical rupture beneath a city and the colour changes, while the seismology does not. The second is the tsunami flag of 0, and the physics there is worth a moment. Tsunamis are not generated by shaking. They are generated by the vertical displacement of a column of water, which means an earthquake makes a tsunami by lifting or dropping the seafloor over a wide area. 3 things govern whether that happens. The earthquake has to be large enough to displace a meaningful area, shallow enough that the deformation reaches the seafloor rather than being absorbed in the rock above, and it has to move the seafloor vertically rather than sideways. A magnitude 5.8 fails the first test comfortably. Even at 10 kilometers depth on a thrust fault, the area involved is far too small to lift enough water to matter. Which brings me to the part of this that I find genuinely instructive, and it is not the earthquake. It is what happened to the earthquake's own description over the following hours. The first published solution placed the event 105 kilometers south-southeast of Atka at a depth of 5 kilometers at 51.41 degrees north and 173.35 degrees west. The reviewed solution, the one now carried in the catalogues, gives 99 kilometers southeast at 10 kilometers depth. Look at what moved there. The distance changed. The bearing changed from south-southeast to southeast, and the depth doubled. None of that is an error, and none of it is a cover-up. It is the ordinary process of a first automated estimate being replaced by a reviewed human one, but it tells you something important about how much confidence to place in any single number attached to an offshore earthquake, and the reason comes down to geometry. To locate an earthquake, you need arrival times at multiple stations, and the accuracy of the location depends on those stations surrounding the event. Surround a quake with instruments and the solution converges tightly. Put every instrument on one side of it, and the solution goes soft, particularly in the vertical direction. This event happened on the seafloor, roughly 60 miles offshore from a chain of islands. Every seismometer capable of recording it well was to the north. There were no stations to the south, because to the south there is nothing but the Pacific Ocean. That produces a specific and well-known artifact. When a depth solution will not converge, the processing software frequently reports a default value, and in the global catalogues that default is very often exactly 10 kilometers. So a stated depth of 10 kilometers for an offshore earthquake should be read less as a measurement and more as a placeholder, a statement that the event was shallow, without a reliable figure for how shallow. And depth, in this specific setting, is not a detail. It is the whole question. Here is why. At a subduction zone, 2 entirely different populations of earthquakes appear at the same point on a map. The first are interface events, the plate boundary itself slipping, one slab grinding past the other along the contact surface between them. Those are the events that scale up into great earthquakes and generate tsunamis, because they displace the seafloor vertically over enormous areas. The second are intraslab events, earthquakes that occur inside the descending plate as it bends, heats, and tears itself apart on the way down. Those are typically deeper, they are mechanically unrelated to the locked boundary above them, and they do not scale the same way. On a map, they plot in the same place. Only depth tells them apart. A magnitude 5.0 at 41 kilometers and a magnitude 5.8 at 10 kilometers could plausibly be one of each, a deeper vent inside the slab, followed by a shallow one on the interface. Or they could both belong to the same population and the depths could be wrong. Without a reviewed moment tensor, which is the calculation that reconstructs the orientation and sense of motion on the fault that broke, the honest answer is that we do not yet know which. Now, the question everybody asks about a sequence like this, and I want to deal with it properly and then set it down. Was the magnitude 5.0 a foreshock? The statistics are unambiguous and they are also unsatisfying. Somewhere between 5 and 10% of moderate earthquakes are, in hindsight, reclassified as foreshocks of something larger. The probability that any given moderate earthquake is followed by a larger one within 3 days sits at roughly 6%, which means that roughly 19 times out of 20, a moderate earthquake is followed by nothing at all. But notice the structure of that claim. Every one of those numbers is retrospective. A foreshock is not a category you can assign in real time. It is a label applied backwards, after the larger event arrives, to something that at the moment it happened was indistinguishable from an ordinary earthquake. There is no signal in a foreshock that marks it as one. If there were, it would not be called a foreshock. It would be called a prediction, and no validated method for that exists anywhere in seismology. So the correct answer to whether the magnitude 5.0 was a foreshock is that it depends entirely on what happens next, and that the odds say nothing will. And as of the point at which this data was compiled, nothing had. The largest event in the sequence remains the magnitude 5.8. Nothing has crossed magnitude 6. That is not a guarantee of anything. It is simply the current state of a sequence that is still being written, and the honest thing is to report it as such rather than to resolve it in either direction. Which leaves the actual question standing, and it is the one this whole first half has been walking toward. A steam explosion at a crater lake on the 16th. 2 earthquakes on the seafloor on the 25th and 26th. 9 days apart on the same island, in the same week that a volcano 200 kilometers west quietly passed 5 years of continuous eruption. The obvious human instinct is to draw a line between them. So let's go and see whether one can be drawn, and the answer turns on 100 kilometers of empty rock. Part 6. 100 kilometers of nothing. 99 kilometers. That is the distance between the earthquake epicenter and the volcano, and it does almost all of the work in what follows. Everything else is detail. Put the two events side by side and the mismatch is almost comical in scale. On one side, a steam explosion operating over a few hundred meters of shallow rock, a plumbing failure in the upper skin of a mountain. On the other, a rupture on a plate boundary at roughly 10 kilometers depth, 99 kilometers offshore, releasing something on the order of 100,000 times more energy across a fault surface measured in tens of kilometers. For one of these to have caused the other, energy has to get from one to the other. There are exactly 2 mechanisms by which that can happen, and both of them are well studied. Let us take them in turn. The first is static stress transfer. When a fault slips, it does not only release stress, it redistributes it. The rock around the rupture is permanently deformed, and that deformation loads some neighbouring faults closer to failure while relaxing others into what is sometimes described as a stress shadow. This is real, it is measurable, and it is one of the standard tools for understanding why aftershocks cluster where they do. You can see the effect in the shape of an aftershock cloud. Aftershocks do not scatter evenly around a main shock. They concentrate at the ends of the rupture and along its edges, in the lobes where the slip pushed the surrounding rock toward failure, and they are conspicuously sparse in the regions that were relaxed. Map those patterns and you are effectively looking at a picture of where the stress went. That is not a theory, it is a routine calculation, and it works. But static stress transfer has a range, and the range is short. The stress change from a rupture falls off steeply with distance. It is meaningful within roughly 1 to 2 fault lengths of the event, and negligible beyond that. So the operative question is, how long is the fault that produced a magnitude 5.8? The answer is on the order of 10 kilometers. Perhaps a little more, depending on the geometry and the stress drop, but that is the scale, 10 kilometers of fault. Which means the zone in which this earthquake meaningfully altered the stress state around it extends perhaps 10 to 20 kilometers from the epicenter. The volcano is 99 kilometers away. That is not a marginal call, that is a factor of 5 to 10 outside the range where the mechanism operates at all. Static stress transfer does not get you from that seafloor to that crater lake, and no amount of framing changes the arithmetic. The second mechanism is dynamic triggering, and this one is more interesting because it genuinely does work at long range. As seismic waves radiate outward from an earthquake, they carry stress with them, and as they pass through distant rock they momentarily strain it. If a fault somewhere far away is already sitting right at the edge of failure, that momentary strain can be the thing that tips it. Remote triggering of this kind is documented. It has been observed at distances of many hundreds and even thousands of kilometers, and it is a real phenomenon. But it comes with 3 conditions attached, and all 3 matter here. The first condition is amplitude. Dynamic triggering at long range is associated with the surface waves of genuinely great earthquakes, the events that ring the whole planet. A magnitude 5.8 does not produce surface waves of that character. Its energy is largely spent within a few tens of kilometers. The second condition is receptivity. Dynamic triggering does not create instability. It only advances the clock on a system already critically loaded and already about to go. A stable system passed over by seismic waves simply shakes and returns to where it was. The third condition is the nature of the response. Even where remote dynamic triggering is documented, what it typically produces is small earthquakes and tremor. It is not a mechanism that reaches into a volcano and initiates an eruption. There is a scale at which earthquake-to-earthquake triggering is genuinely well established, and it is worth naming so the boundary is clear. Slip on one fault routinely triggers slip on a neighboring branch of the same fault system, meters to kilometers away, sometimes within seconds. That is a local phenomenon, operating inside the deformation field of the rupture itself. It is the documented scale. Nothing in the literature supports scaling that behavior up to a moderate earthquake reaching 100 kilometers across a subduction zone to open a crater lake. So on the physics, both candidate mechanisms fail, one on distance, one on amplitude. But the argument that actually ends this question is not a physics argument at all, it is a calendar. The volcanic unrest at the Atka volcanic complex began on the 8th of March. The explosion at Korovin was on the 16th of July. The earthquakes were on the 25th and 26th of July. The volcano started first, by 4 months. You cannot trigger something that has already been happening for a third of a year. Whatever caused the tremor, the sulfur dioxide, the thermal anomaly and the explosion, it was in motion long before the seafloor southeast of the island moved. The sequence is not merely unsupported by the physics, it runs backwards in time, which raises the reverse possibility, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a dismissal. Could the volcano have triggered the earthquakes? Volcanic systems do generate seismicity. Magma moving through rock cracks it, and that produces earthquakes. But volcanic seismicity has a signature. It is shallow, it is small, it is clustered directly beneath or immediately around the edifice, and it very rarely exceeds magnitude 3 or 4. What it does not do is produce a magnitude 5.8 on a plate interface 99 kilometers offshore. That is a different fault, a different depth, a different mechanism, and a different stress regime. Now, I want to give the strongest version of the connection argument a fair hearing before setting it down, because there is a version of it that is not stupid. The strongest version says, fine, no direct causation, but is it not remarkable that 4 things happened in one place in 10 days? And the honest answer is no, it is not remarkable, and there is a number that shows why. In the 7 days covering these events, the United States Geological Survey catalogued 121 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater worldwide. That is roughly 17 a day, every day, in a completely ordinary week. The Aleutian arc is one of the most seismically productive stretches of that total. Meanwhile, the same arc holds 4 of the 5 volcanoes currently on elevated alert in the United States, one of which has been erupting continuously for 5 years. In a region that active over a 10-day window, the expected number of notable events is not 0. Clustering is what the background looks like. Here is the test I would offer instead, so you can check this yourself rather than taking my word for it. If the earthquake had genuinely influenced the volcano, there are things you would expect to see in the record. You would expect a step change in tremor amplitude beginning within hours of the earthquake. You would expect a gas surge. You would expect seismicity migrating from the epicentral region toward the edifice. None of those appear. What appears instead is a volcano that was already restless in March, an explosion in July, seismicity declining immediately after that explosion, and then, 9 days later, unrelated movement on a plate boundary 60 miles offshore. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming, because there is a failure mode on both sides of this. I'm not saying the two systems can never interact. At close enough range, with a large enough earthquake, and with a volcano already primed, the interaction is real and has been observed. What I am saying is that this particular pair of events, at this distance, at these magnitudes, in this order, does not qualify on any of the three axes that would make it plausible. Distance rules out the static mechanism, magnitude rules out the dynamic one, and chronology rules out the direction of causation everyone assumes. There is one more asymmetry worth naming, and it cuts against the tidy story rather than for it. Of the four events in this cluster, three of them, the March unrest, the July explosion, and the continuing eruption to the west, are volcanic, and volcanic systems are the ones with long memories. A magma reservoir responds to things that happened years ago. The earthquakes, by contrast, are the release of strain that has been accumulating on a plate boundary since the last time that boundary slipped, which in this part of the arc means since the middle of the 20th century. So the two halves of this cluster are not even operating on the same clock. One is running on a 4-month unrest sequence layered on top of a decades-long magmatic process. The other is running on a strain budget measured in tens of years. Asking whether one triggered the other in a 9-day window is asking two processes with completely different time constants to have had a conversation. So the events are not connected, which means the thing worth 2 hours here was never the connection. It is what the attempt to check for one exposed, because not connected is not the same as unrelated. Everything in this video, the earthquakes, the crater lake, the 5-year lava flow, the island itself, is the output of a single machine, and it is worth understanding what that machine is. Part 7. The machine they share. Somewhere beneath the Aleutian Trench, a slab of Pacific seafloor is sliding underneath Alaska at somewhere between 50 and 80 millimeters a year. That is it. That is the entire engine. Every event in this video is a byproduct of that one motion, and once you see how the machine works, the question of whether the earthquakes and the volcanoes are connected stops being mysterious and starts being obvious. The rate is not uniform along the arc, and the variation is worth having. At the eastern edge of the Aleutians, convergence runs at roughly 50 to 60 millimeters per year. Follow the chain west and it climbs, reaching something like 75 to 80 millimeters per year near the western terminus. In the units most people think in, that is somewhere between 2 and 3 inches a year, about the rate a fingernail grows, applied to a slab of oceanic crust the size of a small sea. There is a second variable that most coverage leaves out, and it changes the character of the arc from one end to the other. In the east, the Pacific plate meets the boundary close to head-on. Convergence is nearly perpendicular to the trench. Travel west and the angle opens up. By the western Aleutians, the motion has become strongly oblique, which means the plate is not simply diving downward. It is also sliding sideways along the arc as it goes. Atka sits in the central Aleutians, which puts it in the middle of that gradient, mid-range convergence and obliquity that is well developed but not extreme. Now here is how that motion builds a volcano, and it is one of the genuinely counterintuitive processes in geology. Step 1. The oceanic plate that is about to subduct has spent tens of millions of years sitting under seawater. It is not dry rock. Water is locked into the sediments draped over it, and more importantly, water is chemically bound into the minerals of the crust itself, incorporated into their structures during long, slow alteration on the seafloor. Step 2. The slab descends. As it goes deeper, it heats up and the pressure on it rises and those minerals become unstable. They break down, and in breaking down, they release the water that was chemically bound inside them. This is dehydration, and it happens progressively, at particular depths, as particular minerals hit their particular limits. Step 3. That released water rises out of the slab into the wedge of mantle rock sitting above it. And here is the counterintuitive part. The mantle wedge is already extremely hot enough that you would expect it to be molten, except that pressure keeps it solid. Adding water to hot rock under pressure does not add heat. What it does is lower the temperature at which that rock melts. So water arriving from below causes mantle rock to begin melting without anything getting any hotter. The rock did not change temperature. The rules changed. Step 4. That melt is less dense than the rock around it, so it rises. It collects in reservoirs in the crust, evolves chemically as it cools and crystallizes, and eventually builds and feeds a volcano. Two things about that fourth step get flattened in most explanations, and both matter for this story. The first is that the melt does not travel in a straight line from the mantle to the summit. It stalls. It collects in reservoirs at various depths, sits there, cools, crystallizes out some of its minerals, changes composition, and may or may not ever move again. A volcano is not a pipe from the mantle to the sky. It is a series of holding tanks with valves between them, and most of the magma that enters the system never reaches the surface at all. The second is the timescale, and it is not the one people picture. The journey from slab dehydration to eruption is not measured in days. Melt generation, ascent, and storage operate over timescales of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years for the system as a whole, even though the final ascent from a shallow reservoir to the surface can happen in weeks or days. That mismatch is the reason a volcano can appear to do nothing for a human lifetime and still be in the middle of an active process. Now look at where the volcanoes actually are. The Aleutian volcanoes do not scatter randomly across the region. They form a curved chain running parallel to the trench, offset from it by a fairly consistent distance. That is not coincidence, and it is not decorative. The chain traces the line on the surface above the depth at which slab dehydration peaks, typically around 100 kilometers down. Move along the trench and the volcanoes follow, because the geometry that produces them follows. This is why volcanic arcs are one of the most reliably predictable features on the planet in terms of location, and one of the least predictable in terms of timing. Where the volcanoes will be is set by physics you can calculate from the angle of the descending slab. When any particular one of them will erupt is set by the state of a magma reservoir several kilometers underground that nobody can observe directly. The obliquity I mentioned earlier has a consequence here as well. When convergence is oblique rather than head-on, the motion tends to partition. The perpendicular component is taken up by thrusting on the plate boundary, while the parallel component is taken up by strike-slip faulting within the overriding plate, often running right along the volcanic arc itself. That means the western Aleutians are not just a subduction zone. They are a subduction zone with a sideways shear built into them, and the volcanoes sit on top of the seam. So the answer to how the earthquakes and the volcanoes relate is this. The same descending slab produces both. The friction between the slab and the plate above it produces the earthquakes. The water squeezed out of that same slab produces the magma. They are siblings, born of one parent, and their co-location on a map is a consequence of that shared origin, rather than evidence of any interaction between them. Which is why the instinct to connect them is so understandable and so wrong. They occur together because they are made by the same thing, not because one makes the other. It is the difference between two symptoms of one disease and one symptom causing another. And this machine has a property that matters enormously for the rest of this video. It does not switch off. The Pacific plate is not going to stop moving. The dehydration does not pause. Magma production along the Aleutian arc is continuous on any human timescale, which means the arc is always, at every moment, doing something. That is a genuinely different way to think about an alert level. When a volcano goes from normal to advisory, the instinct is to read it as a system waking up, as though the default state was sleep and something has now begun. That is not what is happening. The magma supply was there before the alert and will be there after it is lowered. What changes is whether some part of the system has become active enough, at a shallow enough depth, to produce a signal that instruments on the surface can pick up. An alert level is not a measurement of the volcano. It is a measurement of what we can currently detect about the volcano. And in a place where cloud sits below 10,000 feet most days of the year, those are very different quantities. 5 days ago we looked at the volcanic arc immediately to the west of this one, in Kamchatka, and at how the ash it produces gets picked up by North Pacific circulation and carried east, handed from one aviation advisory region to the next, toward Alaska and Canada. That is the same machine, one segment along. The slab there is a different piece of the same plate, dehydrating at the same depths, feeding a chain of volcanoes that behaves the same way and exports its ash into the same corridor. So if this engine truly never stops, then somewhere along this arc it ought to be possible to catch it in the act. To find a volcano that is not venting in 10-minute pulses once a year, but simply running continuously in the open. There is one. It has been running for 5 years, and its alert level has not changed once in all that time. Part 8. The volcano that has been erupting for 5 years. The highest volcano alert level currently assigned anywhere in the United States has been held by the same mountain, without interruption, for 5 years and 3 days. Not 5 years of monitoring, not 5 years of concern, 5 years of eruption, continuous, uninterrupted, ongoing as you listen to this. Its name is Great Sitkin. It sits at 52.076 degrees north, 176.13 degrees west, on a remote island roughly 23 miles northeast of Adak, which puts it about 200 kilometers west of Atka, along the same arc, on the same subducting slab, fed by the same machine. Its status is watch and orange. Nothing else in the country is above advisory and yellow, and the start date is worth saying carefully, because the anniversary passed 3 days ago, and nobody marked it. Great Sitkin's alert level has been at orange and watch since its first explosive eruption of ash on the 23rd of July 2021. That explosion was followed by lava, and the lava has not stopped. 23rd of July 2021 to the 26th of July 2026. 5 years and 3 days. Let me tell you what that lava has actually done in that time, because the numbers are not dramatic in the way people expect, and that is precisely the point. The flows have filled most of the summit crater, not part of it, most of it. A crater is a hole, and this one has been steadily filled in with rock that arrived molten layer on layer for half a decade. And having filled the crater, the lava has advanced beyond it, spilling into the valleys below. That is a landscape being rebuilt in real time, and there is essentially no footage of it. Here is what the observatory recorded in a single ordinary week, the week running from the 15th to the 22nd of July, 2026. The same week the crater lake at Korovin was preparing to explode 200 kilometers east. Slow lava effusion continued to feed a thick flow inside the summit crater. The flow advanced east-southeast, and they know the direction because radar satellite data showed it moving. Radar, notably, rather than optical imagery, because radar penetrates cloud and optical does not. Seismicity was minor, and was most likely associated with rockfalls tumbling off a growing lava dome. Elevated surface temperatures were identified on most days. Webcam and satellite images showed minor steaming. 2 details in that log are worth pulling out. The first is the radar. Optical satellite imagery is what most people picture, a photograph from orbit, and in the Aleutians it is very often a photograph of a cloud top. Radar does not care. It transmits its own microwave signal and measures what comes back, and clouds are effectively transparent to it. So in a region where the sky is closed most of the time, radar is frequently the only instrument that can answer a question as basic as which direction the lava is moving. The bulletin's ability to state that the flow advanced east-southeast is a radar sentence. The second is the phrase about rockfalls on a growing lava dome. A lava dome forms when magma is too viscous to flow away, and instead piles up over the vent as a steep fractured mound. It grows from the inside, which means its outer surface is constantly being pushed outward, past the point where it can hold together, and pieces of it break off and tumble down the flanks. Those rockfalls register on seismometers, so a substantial fraction of the seismic activity being recorded at Great Sitkin is not magma moving at all. It is the sound of the eruption's own product falling downhill. That is a report of an active eruption of a major volcano in the United States, and it reads like a maintenance log. Now the detail that makes Great Sitkin genuinely strange, and that separates it from almost every volcano the public has heard of. There have been no explosions at Great Sitkin since a single Volcanian explosion on the 25th of May 2021. Volcanian is a specific classification, not a general adjective. It describes a short, violent, cannon-like blast produced when a plug of hardened magma sealing a vent is blown out by the gas pressure that has built up beneath it. Volcanian events are typically brief, seconds to minutes, and they are the characteristic opening act of a system that has been sealed and has just been unsealed, which is a fair description of what happened. The volcano cleared its throat in May, and then, having opened a pathway, it stopped needing to explode at all. 5 years of eruption, 1 explosion at the very beginning, and nothing since. Purely effusive from that point forward. The distinction between effusive and explosive is one of the most consequential in volcanology, and it comes down to 2 properties of the magma: how much gas it holds, and how easily that gas can escape. All magma contains dissolved gas, water, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, held in solution by pressure the way carbon dioxide is held in a sealed bottle. As magma rises, pressure drops, and the gas comes out of solution and forms bubbles. What happens next depends entirely on viscosity. If the magma is fluid enough, those bubbles rise through it, coalesce, and escape ahead of the melt. The magma degasses gradually on the way up and arrives at the surface already largely spent. It pours. That is an effusive eruption, and it can continue for years because it is fundamentally a steady-state process. Magma in at the bottom, lava out at the top. If the magma is viscous, the bubbles cannot escape. They stay trapped, and as the magma continues to rise and the pressure continues to drop, they expand inside a melt that is too stiff to let them go. Eventually, the internal gas pressure exceeds the strength of the surrounding magma, and the whole thing fragments, tearing itself apart into ash and pumice and blasting out under the pressure of its own trapped gas. That is an explosive eruption, and it is over in minutes or hours. Great Sitkin opened with one explosion in May 2021 and then settled into the first mode and stayed there. The system found a stable configuration where gas escapes as fast as it arrives, and it has held that configuration for 5 years, which is a reassuring thing on one reading and an unsettling one on another. Reassuring, because a degassed, steadily effusing volcano is not going to surprise anyone catastrophically tomorrow. Unsettling, because the transition between those two modes is not always slow, and it is not always announced. The monitoring stack watching for exactly that transition is the same one we've been discussing all along: local seismic and infrasound sensors, satellite data, webcams, and regional infrasound and lightning networks. Lightning, in that list, is not decorative. Explosive volcanic plumes generate enormous static charge as ash particles collide and fragment, and they produce lightning that regional detection networks can pick up from very long range. It is a crude sensor, but it is one that works at night, works through cloud, and works when nothing else does. If Great Sitkin ever converts from effusive to explosive, there is a reasonable chance the first confirmation will come from a lightning network rather than from anyone looking at the mountain. Now let me say plainly what I think the real significance of this volcano is, because it is the reason it belongs in a video with this title. Great Sitkin is what a major volcanic eruption in the United States looks like when it happens somewhere nobody lives. There has been no evacuation because there is nobody within 23 miles to evacuate. There has been no emergency declaration because no emergency has been generated. There has been no sustained news coverage because nothing photogenic has happened and nothing has been destroyed except an uninhabited crater. And there has been no ending, because the eruption simply continues, week after week, in bulletins that read like the one I just quoted. 5 years, highest alert level in the country, and if you asked 100 people who follow this subject to name the American volcano currently at the top of the alert scale, I do not think many of them would get it. It is worth being clear that this is not a story about neglect. The observatory has published on Great Sitkin continuously throughout. Weekly status reports, alert level notices, and a body of research work including a formal study of event classification, seismicity and eruption forecasting at the volcano covering the period from 1999 through 2023. The eruption is one of the better documented volcanic sequences in the United States. The documentation exists. What does not exist is any reason for it to travel. There is no evacuation order to report, no highway closed, no town under ashfall, no photograph of a family watching a lava flow approach their house. The story has every element that makes an eruption scientifically significant, and none of the elements that make one visible, and those are two entirely separate sets of criteria. Which reframes the entire question this video started with. When we ask whether the Aleutian arc is waking up, we're asking the wrong question, and the wrong question has been producing the wrong kind of answer for years. The arc is not asleep. It has never been asleep. It has been erupting continuously, for the whole time anyone has been debating whether anything out there is happening. What varies is not the arc's activity. What varies is whether anyone is in a position to notice it. And Great Sitkin gives us the one thing this story has been missing, which is a yardstick. Because now we can ask the Atka question properly. We have a volcano on the same arc, fed by the same slab, that has been erupting continuously for 5 years. Against that, what is 4 months of tremor at a crater lake? The honest answer is that 4 months is nothing. It is not an emergency. It is not a countdown, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. But, and this is the part that keeps the question open rather than closing it, 4 months is also not long enough to conclude the opposite. It is not long enough to say the system has settled, or that this cycle is like the last four, or that the sulfur dioxide detected in March meant nothing. And to see why 4 months is such an uninformative amount of time on this arc, you need to know what was happening underneath Great Sitkin before it erupted, and how long it had been happening for. Because for a very long time, nobody knew where 5 years of lava was coming from. Part 9. 2 reservoirs. When researchers finally imaged the inside of Great Sitkin, they did not find a magma chamber. They found 2. The work was published in Geophysical Research Letters in 2023 by Yang and colleagues, under a title that states the finding and its consequence in one line: double reservoirs, imaged below, Great Sitkin Volcano, Alaska, explain the migration of volcanic seismicity. The method they used is worth understanding, because it is one of the more elegant ideas in modern geophysics, and it solves a problem that is particularly acute in a place like the Aleutians. The traditional way to image the inside of the Earth is to use earthquakes as your light source. An earthquake sends seismic waves through the subsurface. Those waves speed up, slow down, and bend depending on what they pass through. And by recording their arrivals at many stations, you can reconstruct the structure they travelled through. It works well. It also requires earthquakes, in the right places, at the right times, in sufficient numbers, and you do not get to choose when they happen. Ambient noise tomography discards that requirement entirely. The insight is that the Earth is never actually still. Ocean waves pounding on continental shelves, wind loading on the ground, the endless low-frequency hum of the planet, all of it puts a continuous faint vibration into the crust. To a seismologist trying to record an earthquake, that is noise to be filtered out. But if you record it at 2 stations simultaneously for long enough and correlate the 2 records against each other, the random component averages away, and what remains is the signal that travelled between those 2 points. You have, in effect, turned one seismometer into a source and the other into a receiver, using nothing but background hum. Do that across an array, for months, and you can reconstruct the interior. The full-wave version used in this study models the entire waveform rather than just arrival times, which sharpens the result considerably. And what it showed beneath Great Sitkin was a 2-part system. The first component is an upper crustal magma storage area, sitting between -1 and 10 kilometers. That -1 is not a typo. It means the storage region extends above sea level, up into the edifice of the volcano itself, and reaches down to 10 kilometers beneath it. The second is a mid to lower crustal source zone, running from 10 kilometers down to 40 kilometers. 2 reservoirs stacked, connected, at completely different depths. Sit with those depths for a second, because the lower figure crosses a boundary. 40 kilometers is at or below the base of the crust in this setting. It is the depth at which you stop talking about the crust and start talking about the transition into the mantle. So the deeper of those 2 reservoirs is not sitting inside the volcano in any meaningful sense. It is sitting at the bottom of the crust, near the point where mantle melt first arrives, acting as the staging area for everything above it. And the shallow one reaches from 10 kilometers depth, all the way up past sea level into the mountain itself. That is the reservoir that matters on human timescales. That is the one whose pressurization produces the signals a monitoring network can catch, and whose contents can reach the surface in weeks. 2 systems, 30 kilometers apart, doing different jobs on different clocks. And that architecture immediately explained something that had been sitting in the data as an oddity for years: the migration of volcanic seismicity. Earthquakes beneath Great Sitkin had been observed shifting between depths over time, which is difficult to account for with a single chamber. With 2 connected reservoirs and magma transferring between them, migration is exactly what you would expect. The seismicity was tracking the plumbing. The authors went further and proposed a 6-stage eruption cycle for the ongoing 2021 eruption, a sequence of transfers and pressurizations moving between the deep and shallow systems, each stage producing its own seismic signature. That is a hypothesis rather than a settled fact, but it is a hypothesis with a mechanism behind it, and it explains why an eruption might run for 5 years without either escalating or stopping. If the deep reservoir is feeding the shallow one at roughly the rate the shallow one is emptying at the surface, you get exactly what Great Sitkin has been doing: steady output, no crisis, no end. Now, the reason this matters for Atka. If a volcano on this arc can be fed from both a shallow chamber and a deep one, then every single unrest signal becomes ambiguous in a way it would not be with a simple system. Tremor at 5 kilometers depth and tremor at 30 kilometers depth are not variations on a theme. They are events in two different reservoirs with two different meanings, and the shallow one is far closer to producing something at the surface than the deep one, which means the interpretation of any given signal depends on knowing the architecture underneath it, and nobody has imaged the Atka volcanic complex to that resolution. So when the record says a rise in small earthquakes and tremors beginning on the 8th of March, and weak to moderate tremor continuing on the 16th, what we have is a measurement without a map. We know the system is moving fluid. We do not know which reservoir, at what depth, in which direction. And imaging it is not simply a matter of deciding to. Ambient noise tomography works because you have an array of stations recording continuously for months, and you can correlate every pair of them against every other. The resolution you get is a function of how many stations you have and how they are distributed. The denser the array, the finer the picture. Great Sitkin got that treatment because a research program went and did it. Doing the same at the Atka volcanic complex would mean deploying and maintaining a dense seismic array across a multi-vent volcanic system on an island roughly 1,100 air miles from Anchorage, servicing it through Aleutian weather and leaving it running long enough to accumulate the correlations. It is entirely possible. It is also expensive, logistically punishing, and it competes for funding against every other volcano in a chain that has dozens of them. So the map does not exist. And the reason it does not exist is not scientific. It is the same reason as everything else in this story. Then there is the timescale, and this is where Great Sitkin becomes genuinely instructive rather than merely interesting. The eruption began in 2021, but the precursors did not. The earliest precursory signals at Great Sitkin occurred in July 2016. They consisted of deep, long-period earthquakes and volcano-tectonic earthquakes at mid-crustal depths. The signature, researchers concluded, of a deeper intrusion of magma arriving from below. Long-period earthquakes are the interesting ones there, where a volcano-tectonic earthquake is rock simply breaking, a sharp, high-frequency snap. A long-period event has a drawn-out, low-frequency character that is generally interpreted as fluid resonating in a crack. Detecting them at mid-crustal depth is a statement that something fluid was moving deep in the system. And deep, long-period events specifically have a reputation among volcanologists as one of the earliest available warnings that anything is happening at all. They occur far below the levels where most volcanic seismicity is generated. They are frequently the first thing to appear when a new batch of magma arrives from the mantle, and they can precede an eruption by years. The problem is that they can also precede nothing whatsoever. A pulse of magma can arrive at the base of the crust, produce a flurry of deep, long-period events, and then stall there permanently, cooling in place over centuries. So the signal that gives you the most warning is also the signal with the worst false positive rate. That is not a solvable engineering problem. It is a property of the thing being measured, so run the arithmetic on that runway. First precursors in July 2016, Volcanian explosion in May 2021, lava from July 2021, 5 years. 5 years of signals at depth before anything erupted at all, then 5 more years of eruption. Now go back to Atka and hold 4 months against that. If a 5-year runway is anything like the normal timescale on this arc, then 4 months of tremor at Korovin is not late in a process. It is either very early in one, or it is nothing at all, and there is currently no way to tell those apart from the surface. We ran into precisely this problem 2 days ago, looking at Mount St. Helens, where a volcano that is deflating rather than inflating produced a small swarm of deep earthquakes, and the honest reading was that deep recharge and something more concerning produce signals that surface instruments cannot reliably separate. Different arc, different volcano, identical epistemic trap. Which leaves this act on a question rather than an answer, and I think it is the right question. If we cannot tell venting from loading at a volcano we have imaged in 3 dimensions, down to 40 kilometers, with 2 reservoirs mapped and a 6-stage cycle proposed. What exactly are our chances at one we have never imaged at all? Part 10, March 9th, 1957. At 22 minutes past 4 in the morning, local time, on the 9th of March, 1957, the central Aleutian arc produced a magnitude 8.6 earthquake at a depth of 25 kilometers. The Andrianov Islands, 25 kilometers deep incidentally, is exactly where you would want it to be for maximum effect. That is shallow enough that the deformation from the rupture reaches the seafloor rather than being absorbed by the rock above it, and it is on the plate interface itself, the contact surface between the descending Pacific plate and the North American plate above. That interface has a name worth using. It is a megathrust. The word describes the largest fault surface type on Earth, the shallowly dipping contact where one tectonic plate slides beneath another, and it is the only fault geometry capable of producing earthquakes above roughly magnitude 8.5. Every earthquake above magnitude 9 in recorded history has occurred on one. They are large because the fault surface is enormous, hundreds of kilometers wide in the dip direction and potentially thousands long, and shallow dipping, which means when they slip they lift the seafloor rather than shearing it sideways. That is the same island group that contains Atka, the same stretch of plate boundary that produced the magnitude 5.8 on the 26th of July. The largest thing this fault has ever been recorded doing, it did directly beneath the region we have spent this entire video looking at. Approximately 600 kilometers of the plate boundary ruptured. Take a moment with that figure because rupture lengths are one of the hardest things in seismology to convey. 600 kilometers is not a point on a map where something broke. It is a tear in the Earth's crust roughly the distance from New York City to Cleveland, propagating along a fault at somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 kilometers per second, which means the rupture itself took several minutes to run from one end to the other. Somebody standing at the western end of that rupture experienced the earthquake begin while, hundreds of kilometers away, the ground at the eastern end had not yet moved. This is the property of great earthquakes that separates them from everything smaller, and it is almost entirely absent from how they are portrayed. A moderate earthquake is an event. A great earthquake is a process with a direction and a duration. It starts somewhere, it travels, and the shaking at any given location does not stop when the rupture passes. It continues for as long as the rupture is still running somewhere else and sending energy back. That is why the great subduction earthquakes are described by survivors in terms of minutes rather than seconds, and why the damage they do is qualitatively different. Buildings that would survive 30 seconds of shaking fail at 4 minutes because the structure fatigues. And the aftershock zone was larger still. It extended 1,200 to 1,230 kilometers. That figure puts 1957 in genuinely rare company. It is one of the largest aftershock zones ever observed, comparable to the approximate lower limit of the estimated rupture length of the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, the event that produced the deadliest tsunami in recorded history. Laid across the continental United States, a zone that size would reach from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi. Then, the water. Tsunami run-up from the 1957 event reached 23 meters. Run-up is a specific measurement, and it is not the same as wave height offshore. It is the maximum vertical elevation above sea level that the water reached as it climbed the land. 23 meters is roughly 75 feet, the height of a 7-story building measured vertically at the point where the water finally stopped. Now here is the number that I think is the most revealing in this entire video, and it is not a big one. Total damage from the 1957 Aleutian earthquake was approximately $5 million. Casualties, 2, and both indirect. Indirect is a specific classification, and it is worth knowing what it excludes. A direct casualty is someone killed by the earthquake or the wave itself, crushed by a collapsing structure, drowned by the inundation. An indirect casualty is someone who died as a consequence of the event through some other chain. A heart attack, an accident during evacuation, an injury sustained in the aftermath. So the 1957 Aleutian earthquake, a magnitude 8.6 with a 75-foot tsunami, killed nobody directly as far as the record shows. One of the largest earthquakes ever recorded on this planet. 600 kilometers of ruptured plate boundary. An aftershock zone comparable to the 2004 Indian Ocean event. A wall of water 75 feet high. 2 people. I want to be careful about how that lands, because there is a way of saying it that sounds like relief and a way that sounds like the point of the video, and I mean the second one. That death toll is not a fact about the earthquake, it is a fact about the map. There was almost nobody there to kill. The same emptiness that leaves this arc unwatched today is the reason its single worst historical event reads, in the record, as a footnote, $5 million and 2 indirect deaths, in a rupture that would have been a civilizational event almost anywhere else on Earth. Move that identical earthquake to the coast of Japan, or Chile, or the Pacific Northwest, and you are reading a very different page of the 20th century. There is a strange consequence of that for how the event is remembered. Great earthquakes enter public consciousness through their casualties, which means the ones people can name are the ones that struck populated coastlines. 1957 is, by rupture length and by aftershock zone, in the top tier of instrumentally recorded earthquakes. Almost nobody outside seismology has heard of it. It is one of the largest things that has happened on this planet in the last century, and it is functionally invisible, for exactly the same reason everything else in this video is. So the Aleutians are not a low-hazard region. They are a high-hazard region with a low exposure, and those two things get conflated constantly. The hazard is a property of the fault. The exposure is a property of the census. Only one of them has changed since 1957, and it has changed in the direction of fewer people, not more. But exposure is not only about who lives at the epicenter, and this is where a tsunami is categorically different from an earthquake. Shaking is local. It attenuates with distance, and a few hundred kilometers from a rupture the ground is essentially still. A tsunami does not attenuate that way. In deep water it travels at the speed of a commercial jet, losing very little energy, and it does not care what is between the source and the shore, because there is nothing between them but ocean. Which means the population exposed to an Aleutian megathrust rupture is not the 57 people on Atka. It is everyone on the rim of the North Pacific. The earthquake is a local event. The wave is a basin-wide one, and the basin it opens onto contains some of the most densely populated coastline on Earth. That is the actual reason this arc matters, and it is why the 2 indirect deaths in 1957 are a fact about geography rather than a measure of what happened. Which brings us to what 1957 actually tells us about the magnitude 5.8 on the 26th of July, and the answer requires one more piece of arithmetic. The magnitude scale is logarithmic in energy, at roughly a factor of 32 per whole unit. From 5.8 to 8.6 is 2.8 magnitude units. Work that through, and the ratio comes out at roughly 250,000. 250,000 times the energy. That number ends a specific argument that circulates every time a moderate earthquake occurs near a fault capable of a great one. The argument goes, small earthquakes are building toward the big one, each one adding to the total, the pressure is mounting. It does not work like that, and the ratio is Y. You would need on the order of 250,000 magnitude 5.8 events to equal the energy of the 1957 rupture. At the observed rate for a region like this, that is not a countdown. That is geological time. There is a related misconception worth clearing while we are here, which is the idea that frequent small earthquakes relieve pressure and make a large one less likely. That fails on exactly the same arithmetic, running in the other direction. If 250,000 moderate earthquakes are required to match one great one, then the handful that actually occur in any given decade relieve a vanishingly small fraction of the accumulated strain. Small earthquakes neither meaningfully load nor meaningfully unload a megathrust. They are noise on top of a signal driven entirely by plate motion. The stress budget of a great earthquake is not assembled out of moderate ones. It is assembled out of steady plate motion, 50 to 80 millimeters a year of accumulated slip deficit on a locked interface. And moderate earthquakes are a symptom of that accumulation, not a contribution to it. So the honest verdict on the 26th of July is this. It was not a warning shot. It was not a foreshock in any way we can currently identify. It was an ordinary earthquake of an ordinary size in one of the most seismically productive places on the planet. But it did happen inside the footprint of the largest thing this fault has ever been recorded doing. And that footprint has a strange feature in it, a stretch of 600 kilometers of rupture where, according to the models that stood for decades, one half of it barely moved at all. Part 11. The half that didn't move. In a rupture 600 kilometers long, most of the eastern half barely slipped. That is the anomaly in 1957, and it drove hazard thinking in this region for the better part of half a century. The slip distribution is asymmetric in a way that is unusual for an event of this size. Slip was highest in the western half of the rupture zone, near the epicenter, and comparatively little slip occurred in the eastern half. The earthquake ran east across hundreds of kilometers of plate boundary, while releasing progressively less as it went. And that asymmetry is genuinely odd. The intuitive picture of a fault rupture is a crack running along at more or less constant intensity until it hits something that stops it. Real ruptures do not behave that way. They accelerate, decelerate, jump across gaps, and slip by wildly different amounts in different places, governed by variations in friction, in the geometry of the fault surface, and in how much strain each patch had stored when the rupture arrived. Some patches on a megathrust are locked, held firmly by friction, accumulating strain year after year until they fail catastrophically. Others creep, sliding steadily and aseismically without ever producing an earthquake at all. A rupture arriving at a creeping patch tends to die there, because there is no stored strain to release. Which segments are locked and which are creeping is one of the central questions in subduction zone science, and it is measured today with satellite geodesy that did not exist in 1957. Before going further, let me define the term that this observation generated, because it gets used loosely and it deserves precision. A seismic gap is a stretch of an active fault that has not ruptured while the segments on either side of it have. The reasoning behind the concept is straightforward and on its face compelling. If a plate boundary is converging at a steady rate along its whole length, then every segment is accumulating strain at a steady rate. When a segment ruptures, it releases its accumulated strain and resets, so a segment that has not ruptured in a long time, while its neighbours have, must still be holding everything it has accumulated. It is loaded and it is due. Applied to 1957, this reasoning produced a specific and consequential conclusion. The Unalaska Island area, at the eastern end of the aftershock zone, was identified as a possible seismic gap and a possible site of a future large or great earthquake. That assessment shaped how the region was understood. If the eastern segment did not release in 1957, then it has now been storing strain not just since 1957, but since whenever it last ruptured before that, and every year adds more. Then, recently, that assessment was challenged directly, and the way it was challenged is one of the better examples I know of science correcting itself, using evidence that had been physically present the entire time. The reassessment did not come from a new model. It came from going back and looking at what the water did. 3 lines of evidence were brought together. The first was eyewitness reports, accounts from people who were present in 1957 and described what they saw. The second was tide gauge data, the instrumental record of how sea level behaved during and after the event. And the third was geological evidence for tsunami run-ups of 9 to 23 metres, preserved in coastal deposits, and critically, that evidence pointed at run-ups offshore Unalaska Island, the supposed gap. Follow the inference chain, because it is tight. Tsunami run-ups of 9 to 23 metres require a substantial volume of displaced water. Displacing that volume of water requires vertical deformation of the seafloor over a wide area, and vertical deformation of the seafloor requires the fault beneath it to have slipped, which means the eastern segment did move in 1957. Not as much as the west, but enough to throw a wall of water 9 to 23 metres up onto the coastline, and if it moved, then it released strain, and if it released strain, then it was never the loaded waiting gap the model described. The gap was an artifact of incomplete measurement, a consequence of the fact that in 1957 the instrumental coverage of the central Aleutians was thin, and the slip in the eastern half was inferred from a seismic record that could not resolve it well. I think this is worth dwelling on, because of what it says about the tools rather than about this specific fault. Seismic gap reasoning is one of the main frameworks used to say which parts of a subduction zone should worry us next. It is applied to Cascadia, to Japan, to Chile, to the Aleutians. It is the intellectual machinery behind a large fraction of the sentences you will ever read containing the word overdue. And here is a case, on one of the best-studied great earthquakes of the 20th century, where the gap turned out not to be a gap. Not because the reasoning was invalid, but because one of its inputs, how much slip actually occurred where, was wrong, and stayed wrong for decades, until somebody went back to the sediment and the tide gauges and read the answer that had been sitting there all along. That is not a failure. That is the process working slowly in the only direction it can work, toward more evidence. It does, however, carry a warning about confidence. Somewhere between the original assessment and the reassessment, there were decades during which the eastern Aleutians were described in the literature and in public communication as a gap, a place storing strain, a candidate for the next great earthquake. That description was made in good faith by competent people using the best available data, and it was wrong. Which should make anyone cautious about the equivalent sentences being written today, about this arc and about every other one. Not cynical, the science is the best tool available and it is genuinely improving, but cautious about the specific move of taking a model output and treating it as an observation The gap was a model output. The sediment was an observation. When they finally met, the sediment won. Now bring it back to Atka, and here is where I have to give you the calibration rather than the drama. Atka sits in the central portion of the 1957 rupture, the region toward the western half where slip was greatest. The instinct is to read that as bad news, because greatest slip sounds like greatest danger. It is the opposite. A fault segment that slipped a great deal in 1957 is a segment that released its accumulated strain in 1957. It reset. It started from zero, or close to it, and it has been reloading ever since. So the segment beneath Atka is, on this reasoning, the part of the arc with the least accumulated deficit rather than the most. I am telling you that plainly because the alternative would be to leave you with a scarier impression than the evidence supports, and there is enough genuinely unresolved in this story without manufacturing more. There is a caveat attached to that reassurance, though, and it is the same caveat the gap story just taught us. All of this reasoning depends on knowing how much slip occurred, where in 1957, and the eastern half of that rupture has already been revised once, decades after the fact, on the strength of tide gauges and coastal sediment. The slip distribution is a reconstruction from a 1950s instrumental record, not a direct measurement. So the correct posture on the central segment is confidence tempered by the knowledge that our confidence about the eastern segment was misplaced for 50 years. The reasoning is sound. The input it runs on is an estimate. What is true is the reloading arithmetic, and the concept underneath it deserves a sentence. Slip deficit is the gap between how far two plates should have moved past each other, given their convergence rate and the elapsed time, and how far they actually have. If the interface is locked, the plates keep converging, but the fault surface does not slip, so the difference accumulates as elastic strain in the surrounding rock. The crust is being wound like a spring. The deficit is, quite literally, the amount of slip the fault owes. Convergence here runs at somewhere between 50 and 80 millimeters a year. 69 years have passed since 1957. Multiply it through, and you get somewhere in the region of 3.5 to 5.5 meters of accumulated slip deficit on that interface since the last time it let go. Several meters is a real number. It is not a great earthquake. The 1957 event involved far more than that across a 600-kilometer rupture. But it is not nothing either, and it grows every year at a rate that does not vary. Which leaves this act where it has to end. The fault beneath Atka has a documented ceiling of magnitude 8.6. It has a documented history of behaving in ways that surprised the people modelling it, for decades, until somebody went and checked the sediment. It is reloading at a rate we can measure precisely, and it is being watched by the same monitoring network that could not tell us whether a 10-minute steam explosion produced an ash cloud, because there was a layer of ordinary weather sitting at 10,000 feet. Part 12. What else was happening? 121. That is how many earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater were catalogued worldwide in the 7 days covering everything in this video. Roughly 17 a day. Every day. In a week nobody described as unusual. Hold that number while I read you the rest of what was happening on the planet on the 26th of July, 2026. 2 days earlier, a magnitude 6.0 struck 82 kilometers west of Sola, in Vanuatu, at 44.6 kilometers depth, accompanied in the same region by a magnitude 5.1 and a magnitude 4.9. That magnitude 6.0 was the largest earthquake anywhere on Earth in the entire 7-day window, and it happened roughly 9,000 kilometers from Alaska. On the day itself, a magnitude 5.3 near Kupang, in the Timor region of Indonesia, at 10 kilometers depth. A magnitude 5.2 in the Tristan da Cunha region of the South Atlantic. A magnitude 5.0 off the west coast of New Zealand's South Island. A magnitude 4.7 near Pinglin, Taiwan, at roughly 94 kilometers depth. A magnitude 4.7 in Colombia. A magnitude 4.6 offshore Guatemala. A magnitude 4.6 near the coast of Nicaragua. And a magnitude 4.5 in the Fiji region at 372 kilometers depth, deep enough inside the descending slab that it is essentially incapable of doing damage at the surface, because the energy has 372 kilometers of rock to cross before it gets anywhere near a person. Now, the volcanoes. In the same weekly reporting window, 20 separate volcanoes appeared in the Global Activity Bulletin. Krakatoa, with ash plumes rising 200 meters above the summit. Etna, with gas emissions along the fissure between two of its summit craters and explosive activity at two others. Sakurajima in Japan measured at 2,200 tons of sulfur dioxide per day, with ash to 1.7 kilometers. Ambay in Vanuatu throwing ash and gas to between 2.7 and 4.3 kilometers and disrupting flights. Merapi in Java producing between 8 and 14 lava avalanches a day, some travelling 2 kilometers. Semeru with 2 pyroclastic flows down its southeast flank. Mayon in the Philippines with lava effusion and periodic pyroclastic density currents. Canlaon recording between 8 and 36 volcanic earthquakes daily. Kilauea still fountaining episodically in Hawaii. Most of those are not new eruptions, they are continuing ones, volcanoes that have been erupting for months or years and will still be erupting next month. That distinction is the one that gets lost most often. A weekly volcanic activity bulletin is not a list of things that started. It is a status report on things that are ongoing, and the same names recur in it week after week for years at a time. Reading one bulletin cold, with no baseline, produces an impression of a planet in crisis. Reading 50 of them in sequence produces an impression of a planet doing what it always does. So here is the point of that list, and it is the argument against the framing this cluster will inevitably attract. Whenever several notable events land in a short window, the phrase that appears is that the Ring of Fire is waking up. It is a compelling phrase and it is wrong, and the reason it is wrong is sitting in the numbers I just read you. 17 magnitude 4.5 events a day, 20 volcanoes in a single weekly bulletin. That is the background. That is what a completely ordinary week on this planet looks like when you aggregate it. What clusters is not the geology, it is the coverage. And the mechanism behind that illusion is worth naming, because it is not really about earthquakes at all. Any process that produces events at a steady average rate will produce clumps. Randomness is lumpy. Evenly spaced events are actually the signature of something regulating the process, not of chance. So a run of notable events in a short window is not merely compatible with a purely random background. At 17 a day, it is guaranteed to happen regularly, and the only variable is whether anybody happens to be paying attention when it does. Plate boundaries on opposite sides of an ocean basin are mechanically independent. There is no known mechanism by which a magnitude 5.8 in the Aleutians influences a magnitude 5.3 near Timor, 9,000 kilometers away, and the sequence in which they appear on a feed is an artifact of how the feed is sorted, not evidence of a relationship. There was one genuinely new volcanic item that week, and it belongs in this video for a reason that has nothing to do with the Aleutians. Ahi Seamount is a submarine volcano in the Northern Mariana Islands. It was flagged for new eruptive activity because of what satellites saw on the surface of the ocean above it. Small plumes of discoloured water identified on the 1st, the 7th, and the 11th of July. Discoloured water had been appearing intermittently there for months, but these particular plumes had more discrete shapes than the earlier ones, which was interpreted as suggesting more vigorous activity underneath. Each one drifted less than 500 metres from the vent area, and no signals at all were detected on the underwater pressure sensors. Sit with that combination for a moment, because it is the same problem this entire video has been circling. Here is a volcano whose only visible evidence of eruption is a stain on the surface of the sea, observed from orbit in plumes measured in hundreds of metres, while the instruments placed specifically to detect it heard nothing. A crater lake hidden beneath a cloud deck and a submarine vent hidden beneath the ocean are the same monitoring problem wearing different clothes. One last item, and this one functions as a control. Space weather on the 26th of July was about as close to inert as it gets. The geomagnetic scale read 0. The 24-hour peak planetary K-index was 2. Solar wind speed was 496 kilometers per second, which is unremarkable. The interplanetary magnetic field measured 3 nanotesla, which is weak, and its north-south component was pointing northward, which is the orientation that does not couple efficiently with Earth's magnetic field and therefore does not drive geomagnetic activity. Auroral power sat at 15 gigawatts in the Northern Hemisphere, below the roughly 20 gigawatt benchmark for quiet conditions. No Earth-directed coronal mass ejections had been observed. I include that for one reason. Every time a notable earthquake occurs, a version of the claim appears that solar activity triggered it. A flare, a storm, an alignment. On the 26th of July, the sun was doing nothing. Quiet field, weak wind, northward orientation, no ejections, aurora below the quiet benchmark, and the Aleutian arc produced the largest earthquake on the planet anyway. That is not an argument. That is a control, and it removes solar triggering from the table without my having to spend a minute on the mechanism. So the Aleutian cluster is not statistically special. On the numbers, it is exactly what a busy plate boundary produces in an ordinary 10 days. What is special about it is that it happened in the one place where almost nobody was going to check. Part 13. The Blank Bulletin. 15 minutes after the magnitude 5.8, an entry appeared in NOAA's tsunami product feed. It had a title, 50 miles southeast of Atka Village, Alaska. It had coordinates, 51.718 north, 173.406 west. It had a timestamp, 8:50 and 35 seconds coordinated universal time, and it had no message. The summary field was completely empty. Let me say immediately what that is not, because this is the single detail in this story most likely to be screenshotted and mislabeled. The United States Geological Survey assigned the earthquake a tsunami flag of 0. No earthquake in the entire 7-day catalogue carried a tsunami flag. Independent verification returned no warning, no watch, and no advisory associated with the event. There was no tsunami threat, and there was never a tsunami threat. Now, this channel has seen this exact artifact before, and the more useful of the two occasions was in this exact arc. Back in April, a magnitude 5.4 struck near Dutch Harbour in the eastern Aleutians at 35 kilometres depth. Roughly 3 minutes later, an automated tsunami notification appeared in the feed for an event that, by any straightforward magnitude and depth rule, should not have crossed an automated threshold at all. A magnitude 5.4 at 35 kilometres is nowhere near tsunamigenic. The explanation we reached then still holds, and it is worth carrying forward rather than deriving again. The warning system appears to apply location-specific lower thresholds in the eastern Aleutian arc. It is tuned to evaluate events there that it would ignore elsewhere. And the reason for that sensitivity is historical. This is a corridor where, in the 1940s, submarine slope failure generated tsunami run-ups wildly out of proportion to the earthquake that started them. That is the general principle, and it is the one worth taking away. Because a landslide can be triggered by a moderate earthquake, and can then displace far more water than the earthquake itself ever would, slope failure hazard does not scale cleanly with magnitude. A rule that says do not evaluate anything below magnitude 7 would work almost everywhere and would fail here. So the system in Alaskan waters is deliberately twitchy. It opens a file on events that a magnitude-based rule would discard, and an opened file that gets evaluated and closed without a threat looks exactly like what appeared on the 26th of July, a record with a title, coordinates, a timestamp, and nothing in the body. The design philosophy behind that is worth stating plainly, because it is the opposite of what the artifact looks like. A tsunami warning system has two ways to fail. It can fail by issuing a warning for a wave that never arrives, which costs money, disrupts lives, and erodes public trust in the next warning. Or it can fail by staying silent for a wave that does arrive, which costs lives. Those two failures are not symmetric, and every warning system on Earth is deliberately tuned toward the first one. So the automated evaluation fires early and often. It fires on events that will turn out to be nothing, which is most of them, and each of those evaluations leaves a record. What you're looking at when you see an empty summary field is not a system concealing an answer. It is a system that asked a question, got the answer no, and left the question in the log. There is a version of media literacy that applies here more than any amount of seismology. When a public feed shows you something that looks like an obvious smoking gun, a form with a scary title and a suspiciously empty body, the first hypothesis should be that you're looking at the plumbing of a large automated system rather than at a decision somebody made. The same empty summary signature turned up again a week ago on a product tied to the Chiapas sequence off southern Mexico, and it meant the same thing there. 3 instances now, 2 of them in Alaska, all 3 with the same explanation. So the conspiracy reading closes cleanly. For that blank field to represent a suppressed warning, the suppression would have to extend to the United States Geological Survey, which published a tsunami flag of 0, to the European Monitoring Network, which published its own independent solution, and to every downstream outlet that carried the earthquake. All 3 published normally, within minutes, contradicting nothing and hiding nothing. There is one more reason this particular artifact keeps appearing in Alaska specifically, and it closes the loop on the whole section. The Eastern Aleutian Corridor is not merely a place with a tsunami history. It is a place where the tsunami history is anomalous, relative to the seismology, where the waves were bigger than the earthquakes that caused them had any business producing. That is why the thresholds there are set where they are. And it is why an entirely unremarkable magnitude 5.8, 99 kilometers southeast of an island, with 57 people on it, generated a piece of paper at 8:50 in the morning Coordinated Universal Time. The blank bulletin is not a redaction. It is a form that was opened and closed. Part 14. The sky is the instrument. The reason nobody can tell you what Korovin did on the 16th of July is that there was a layer of cloud sitting below 10,000 feet. That is where this ends, and I want to lay out the full inventory one more time, because assembled in one place, it is a genuinely strange picture of a country's relationship with its own geology. 4 of the 5 volcanoes currently on elevated alert in the United States are in Alaska. One of them has been erupting continuously for 5 years and 3 days, at the highest alert level assigned anywhere in the country, filling its own summit crater with lava and spilling into the valleys beneath it in near total public silence. Another sits 10 miles from a community of 57 people and has produced 4 separate explosive events in 3 years, the most recent of them preceded by 4 months of tremor, magmatic gas, and thermal anomalies visible from orbit. And underneath all of it runs a plate boundary that produced a magnitude 8.6 and a 75-foot wall of water inside living memory, and killed 2 people because there was nobody there. None of it is connected. I have spent 2 hours showing you why. The distances are wrong, the magnitudes are wrong, and the chronology runs backwards. The volcano started 4 months before the earthquakes, and no mechanism carries stress 100 kilometers to a crater lake. And I want to be honest about why that answer is a harder sell than the alternative, because I think the reason matters. A chain reaction is a story. It has a beginning, a mechanism, and a direction, and it converts a scattered collection of events into something a person can hold in their head. Coincidence in a highly active region converts the same events into a list. One of those is far more satisfying than the other, and the more satisfying one is almost always the wrong one. The instinct behind it is not stupidity. It is pattern recognition doing exactly what it evolved to do, on a dataset it was never built for. A global feed aggregating 17 earthquakes a day from every plate boundary on the planet and presenting them in a single scrolling column. Nobody's intuition is calibrated for that. Mine is not either. The only defense is the base rate, which is why I read you the numbers. That was never the frightening part. Here is the frightening part, and it is smaller and quieter than a chain reaction, and it will not fit on a thumbnail. We can image the inside of a volcano in 3 dimensions and resolve it into 2 separate magma reservoirs, one of them 40 kilometers down at the base of the crust. We can detect a 10-minute steam explosion on an uninhabited island from hundreds of kilometers away, using pressure waves below the range of human hearing. We can publish an earthquake's location, depth, and magnitude within minutes of the ground moving, and then revise all 3 in public as better data arrives. And with all of that, we cannot tell you whether 4 months of tremor beneath a crater lake means a volcano let go of its pressure or started building it. The answer to that question may already exist. It may be sitting in the deposits from the 16th of July right now, fresh volcanic glass, or only shattered old rock, the single cleanest test of whether magma was involved. It is a physical object on a mountainside in the North Pacific, and the reason nobody has read it is not funding or policy or secrecy. It is weather. And there is a version of that inventory that should be reassuring rather than alarming, so let me say it before the ending, because I do not want to leave a false impression. Nothing in this data suggests that anyone is in danger. The explosion was small and self-limiting. The earthquakes were moderate, green-rated, and produced no tsunami. Great Sitkin has been doing the same thing for 5 years and shows no sign of doing anything else. The observatory raised alert levels in advance, published its reasoning, and made all of it available to anybody who went looking. On the evidence, the system worked. The unease in this story is not about what happened. It is about the width of the gap between what we can measure and what we can conclude, and that gap does not close by anybody trying harder. So here is what to watch, and it is one specific thing rather than a feeling. Seismicity at the Atka volcanic complex declined immediately after the explosion ended on the 16th of July. That decline is the strongest evidence for the reassuring reading. A system that built pressure for 4 months found a weak point, vented it, and reset. The next observatory update will show whether it stayed down, because if the tremor stays gone, this was a volcano exhaling, and if it comes back, if the tremor returns, and the sulfur dioxide climbs again, and the thermal anomaly holds through the autumn, then the 16th of July was not the end of anything. It was the first small thing that got out.